Welcome back and welcome to session 9. Can you believe it? You're doing so great. Keep it up. During this session, you should continue to do your morning and evening exercises. The Lester Love technique, it remains optional, but of course is incredibly powerful and highly recommended. I recommend trying to get in a couple of group awareness exercise sessions during that. And you're going to have a new method that you will do from 30 to 60 minutes per day. Before we go on, let's talk a little bit about what to expect around fundamental well-being. Usually by this point, enough participants have started to transition that some of those who haven't are beginning to experience a bit of frustration. They're hearing others discuss their change, and they feel that they've been working just as hard as they did to no avail. Well, that's perfectly understandable. Remember, this is a matching game. If you haven't transitioned yet, it's most likely just because you haven't found your methodological fit. The method for this session and the following ones are completely different than what's come previously in the course. So they are each something entirely new that you might match up with. Let me also talk a little bit about the process of shifting. Something very important to keep in mind, especially this session with the new method that we cover, is that it's important to remember that you are not an object. Now, I know that you may be saying to yourself, well, what do you mean? I've got this body's in this room. How am I not an object? It's true in some sense that your body is an object in your awareness. Your mind is also an object in your awareness, and your mind is what is experiencing and labeling all of the things that were just mentioned. That's all true, but there's another truth. One of the things that you're going to uncover very soon, if you haven't already, is that all of that can be the case, but at the same time, you're also not an object. This is why it doesn't really make any sense to search for yourself with the mind. The mind only searches through objects. Everything in the mind is an object, some sort of symbolic representation of something else, even if it's a representation of an actual emotion or physiological experience that's happening in the body. It's not the actual physiological experience. It's not even the direct experience of that physiological experience. It's an abstracted mental structure built around that. That's not to say that the raw underlying sensation isn't a part of it, but it's sort of got a concoction around it, like a cocoon wrapper around it, or an intermediary filtering layer to it. So it's not really being directly sensed by you. Unless you're in fundamental well-being, and even then a certain depth of fundamental well-being, there really isn't anything right now that's being directly sensed without this mental object-based filter. So this is one of the most important understandings you can have, and it's one of those things that this program is designed to help bring you to the direct experience of. Of course, as I say this, your mind is just going to grab onto it, and now it's an object in your mind. So we need to be very, very careful of that. But in this case, at this moment, there's really no choice but to put this concept into your mind and just directly say that you are not an object. What this means is that if you're looking for fundamental well-being with your mind, that's not ideal, because your mind can only know objects, and you're not an object. You can't be in fundamental well-being from within the mind. You just can't. So that's a little bit of a tricky thing about these ways of experiencing the world. And one of the key things that we're going to try to get you to experientially during the course. Now, there's all sorts of religions and spiritual systems and philosophies that have tried to get at this in different ways. For instance, there's one interesting practice where for literally anything that comes to mind, anything that you experience, the practitioner is just supposed to acknowledge it and then say, yep, that's not it. It's because literally anything that can come to mind about fundamental well-being is not actually persistent fundamental well-being. You can't know it. You can't get to it through the mind because it's not an object. If anything, it's more of a container for all of the experiences and objects and other stuff. So you really can't get behind it and make an object out of it. You can, of course, reflect on its various properties and make abstractions out of them. We've done a lot of that in the research in order to try to communicate what fundamental well-being is like. So you can reflect on, say, whether or not there is a change in the nature or amount of self-related thoughts. And you can make a note of that. However, that abstraction is not the actual thoughts themselves or the lack thereof. These reflections and the abstractions that come from them can help you to figure out where you're at. However, trying to create an idea or imagine your way to an abstraction in hopes that it will lead to the underlying experience is generally not useful. All right, so that's our first point. The second point is that fundamental well-being is really just a shift in perspective. It's a very simple shift. In fact, you've heard a lot about it at this point. You've probably heard a lot of people say things like, I couldn't believe it. When it happened to me, it was just so simple. How have I not noticed this before? It's there all the time, you know? Well, that can be very frustrating to hear if you're not in fundamental well-being because it doesn't seem simple when you're not in it, right? It doesn't seem like it's there all the time. And in fact, it might not be. It might just seem that way from within fundamental well-being. There's a tremendous amount of mental suffering that occurs from people trying to make experiences like that fit when they hear them from other people. However, those comments are useful to us in a way because they allude to the fact that really, this is just a simple shift in perspective. And combined with our earlier point, it's a shift in perspective away from a primarily mental or mind-based consciousness where there's always a filter that things are going through that's objectifying them and turning everything into mental representations and objects. Another way to think about that is that our mind-based consciousness is turning everything into symbols that can be operated on in some way or analyzed or thought about or compared or whatever else. All of those filters become our primary experience of the world. Fundamental well-being brings a shift to a different perspective, where the importance and primacy of this is increasingly and often significantly reduced and minimized. It's not eliminated. Those parts of our mental architecture remain intact, and that's important because they certainly have a role to play in terms of our being able to operate in the world. However, less and less they filter how we experience life from moment to moment, and it really is just a very simple shift in perspective and what is prioritized within the brain, but a remarkably impactful and important one. If you're not already there, let's see what the new method in this session does for you. Let's get started. I'll see you on the next video.